So the mediator pattern is really our friend when it comes to being able to have a loosely coupled but still very performant and direct way to have our modules talk to one another inside of this monolithic application. We don't need an out-of-process database or message bus or any of that as long as all of our communication between our modules is happening in the same monolithic application. Everything is in the same process, right? So we don't need to go out of process to communicate. Mediator lets us do that. It's an object-oriented design pattern that does not have any dependencies on external infrastructure. All right, so if we look at this sequence diagram, you've got a client and it wants to make some kind of a call to a third party that might be in a different module. So it's going to make a query or it's going to send a command to this mediator type. The mediator's only job in this scenario is to take messages from one side and pass them off to someone on the other side. Sometimes it's a one for one, sometimes it's a one for many, right? Typically, if you are doing a query or a command, it's going to have a single handler and it's going to return some result like you see here. So when the handler is done, it's going to hand off this result. The mediator is going to pass that back to the client who is sitting there patiently waiting for that result. This is a blocking call that's happening synchronously. The only difference if you were doing something like domain events, which we'll talk about later, would be that the client would send an event and would not be waiting for a response. But the mediator might find that there are multiple handlers subscribed to that event, and it would call each one of them one after the other to pass them the event and let them handle it. Now, in this case, we already have this wired up in our code. So just so you can see what this looks like, in the exact same method that we were just in, we would create a query object. This is the book details query, and it's defined in the contracts project of the books module. We're going to pass in whatever data we need, in this case, the book ID. Then we're going to invoke mediator. This is an instance of mediator that we've passed into our class here. We're going to await on the actual response. Unfortunately, mediator doesn't use the async suffix on its method, so it's just mediator.send, even though it should be mediator.send async. But regardless, we pass it the query. And what happens is immediately in process, it's going to go out to that other module, find a handler that is set up for this, and execute that code. So to see this in action and just to understand for very clearly that this is not going out of process, this is not using any external infrastructure, it's all in this request, it's all in this thread, let's go ahead and hit this in the debug mode. All right, so here we are, we've hit the mediator send. We're going to step into this method, and you can see what we're composing a DB context, and that's because we're composing a repository, and that's because we're composing a book service, and that's because we're actually hitting a book details query handler. All right, so we had to instantiate all those dependencies just to get to the handler, and now that we're on the handler, we're going to hit the handle method, and it's going to return back our result, right? But we did all of that in process. None of that was out of process. It was a blocking call. If we weren't able to instantiate that handler, this call would have blown up. And importantly, no other threads were involved. You know, there is the await operator there. So if there's some IO to go talk to a database, yes, we would be freeing up the thread momentarily while we wait for IO and then coming back. But the actual operation itself is synchronous. We're going to sit here and wait on line 98 until that operation is done. That's what the await operator is doing for us. And then we're going to proceed once we get the result of our query. Once everything is done, we get 200 OK. Everything worked as expected. So hopefully you can see how the mediator is really helpful for us when we're trying to decouple the different modules inside of our architecture and still allow them to communicate with one another in a quick, blocking, but direct manner. We are going to show some other ways that you can coordinate and communicate between modules, but remember the mediator one should be your go-to. It should be your default of how you're going to do inter-module communication inside your modular monolith architecture.